Number 10. Moldy bread band-aids. Picture this. You're a peasant in ancient Egypt. You've just sliced your hand open while trying to build a pyramid under questionable labor laws. And now it's getting red, puffy, and generally looks like it's about to secede from the rest of your arm. You go to the local physician, who is also probably the local priest and part-time crocodile wrestler. He takes one look at your festering wound, nods sagely, and heads to the back. You're expecting some divine chant, maybe a fancy rap. Instead, he comes back with a slice of moldy, disgusting, fuzzy bread and just slaps it right on there. Your first reaction is probably, "Great. Now I have a gangrenous wound and a science experiment living on it." You'd be forgiven for thinking this was the ancient equivalent of putting butter on a burn. A useless folk remedy that just makes things worse. But here's the kicker. It actually worked. What those Egyptians, and later the Greeks and even medieval Europeans, stumbled upon was the world's first antibiotic. The specific type of green-blue fuzz that grows on bread is often Penicillium mold. The very same stuff Alexander Fleming would famously discover thousands of years later after leaving a petri dish out while on vacation. This mold produces penicillin, a substance that absolutely demolishes bacteria. It wages a microscopic holy war on the infection trying to turn your arm into liquid. So while it looked like they were just treating a serious injury with a forgotten lunch, they were accidentally performing advanced microbiology. They had no idea why it worked, of course. They probably attributed it to Ra the sun god being in a particularly good mood. But the result was the same. The infection cleared up. It's a perfect example of humanity tripping over a brilliant scientific discovery and then using it for centuries without a clue how it functioned. Basically, your ancestors cured infections with the biological equivalent of a forgotten sandwich. Number 9. Willow bark headaches. You've got a splitting headache. The kind that makes you think your brain is trying to punch its way out of your skull. Today, you'd pop a couple of aspirin and wait for the sweet, sweet relief. But 4,000 years ago, your options were a bit more rustic. An ancient Sumerian doctor might hand you a piece of willow bark and tell you to chew on it. It's bitter, it's splintery, and it tastes like you're eating a tree, because you are. But after a while, your headache would actually start to fade. This wasn't a placebo effect or some kind of distraction from the awful taste. That willow bark is packed with a chemical called salicin. When you chew it and your body digests it, it gets converted into salicylic acid. If that name sounds familiar, it should. In the late 1800s, a chemist at a little company called Bayer figured out how to synthesize a slightly modified, less stomach-irritating version of it called acetyl salicylic acid. We know it today as aspirin. So for thousands of years, people from ancient Sumeria to Greece to Native American tribes were all prescribing the exact same thing: go lick a tree. Hippocrates, the supposed father of medicine, wrote extensively about the pain-relieving and fever-reducing properties of willow bark. They had nature's Tylenol right there. They just had to be willing to get a few splinters in their gums to get it. It's a bit like finding out that the cure for the common cold is just to aggressively stare at a squirrel. The method is bizarre. The science is invisible to them, but the result is undeniable. The most popular pain reliever in the world started out as a prescription to go make out with the local foliage. Number 8. Shocking eels. Let's say you're a wealthy Roman suffering from a bad case of gout. Your foot is so swollen and painful that even the thought of a gentle breeze is enough to make you cry. You've tried everything: potions, poultices, sacrificing a goat to Jupiter, but nothing works. So, you go to a specialist. He leads you to a tub of water and tells you to step in. As you do, he casually tosses in a live electric eel. What follows is a jolt of pure, unadulterated voltage that makes every muscle in your body clench. It's horrible, it's terrifying, and weirdly, your foot feels better. Welcome to the ancient world's first TENS unit. For centuries, physicians used the natural electricity from fish like the torpedo ray and the electric eel to treat a variety of ailments, from headaches to gout to epilepsy. A Roman physician named Scribonius Largus was a huge fan, prescribing live torpedo fish to be placed on the foreheads of migraine sufferers. His logic was simple. A powerful numbness overtakes the body, so the original pain is expelled. He wasn't entirely wrong. The electric shock essentially overwhelms your nerve endings. Your nervous system is so busy processing the "Holy Zeus, I'm being electrocuted" signal that it doesn't have the bandwidth to also transmit the "ouch, my foot hurts" signal. It's a biological denial of service attack on your pain receptors. This is the rudimentary principle behind modern electrotherapy, which uses controlled electrical currents to manage pain. The Romans just had a much slimmer, more unpredictable, and frankly more terrifying way of doing it. It's the medical equivalent of fixing a frozen computer by smacking it really hard. It's crude, it's violent, but sometimes it just works. Number 7. The Maggot Buffet. There is perhaps no image more associated with decay and filth than a pile of writhing maggots. So if you had a wound so badly infected that the flesh was literally rotting off the bone, the absolute last thing you'd want to see is a doctor approaching you with a jar full of them. And yet, for centuries, that was one of the most effective treatments available. This wasn't a punishment. This was advanced wound care. Military surgeons from the Napoleonic Wars all the way through World War I noticed a bizarre phenomenon. Soldiers whose wounds became infested with maggots were more likely to survive than those whose wounds were kept clean. It seemed insane, but the evidence was right there. It turns out that certain species of maggots are the world's most precise, efficient, and disgusting little surgeons. They are incredibly picky eaters. They will only consume dead, necrotic, infected tissue. They crawl into all the nooks and crannies of a wound that a surgeon's scalpel can't reach and just eat the rot. But they're not just a cleanup crew. Their saliva contains powerful antimicrobial enzymes that disinfect the wound, killing off harmful bacteria like MRSA. They also secrete substances that stimulate the growth of healthy tissue. They debride, disinfect, and promote healing all at once. It's a 3-in-1 miracle cure that just happens to be the stuff of nightmares. This practice, known as maggot debridement therapy, fell out of favor with the advent of antibiotics. But guess what? With the rise of antibiotic-resistant bacteria, it's making a major comeback. So yes, the cure for your gangrenous leg wound is to turn it into a 5-star all-you-can-eat buffet for a bunch of fly babies. Bon appétit. Number 6. Skull hole therapy. Imagine you're suffering from chronic migraines, seizures, or maybe you just feel possessed by a particularly grumpy spirit. A healer looks you over, nods with deep understanding, and then picks up a sharp rock. His solution is simple. He's going to carve a hole in your head. This is trepanation, the oldest surgical procedure known to humanity. Archaeologists have found skulls with these man-made holes that are over 7,000 years old. And the truly wild part isn't that they did it. It's that a surprising number of people survived. We know they survived because the bone around the hole shows clear signs of healing and regrowth, meaning the patient lived for years, maybe even decades, after having their skull turned into a piece of Swiss cheese. Now, for things like demonic possession, the benefits were questionable. But for certain medical conditions, this horrifying procedure actually made perfect sense. If you suffered a head injury, your brain could swell up. The problem is, your skull is a fixed, bony box. It doesn't stretch. As the brain swells, the pressure inside your cranium skyrockets, crushing brain tissue and leading to death. Trepanning was, in effect, a pressure release valve. By drilling a hole, they allowed the swelling to go somewhere, relieving the intracranial pressure and saving the person's life. It was a brutal, desperate, last-ditch effort, but it was based on a sound mechanical principle. It's the same reason neurosurgeons today will sometimes remove a piece of the skull in severe trauma cases. They just use sterile drills and anesthesia instead of a flint knife and a prayer. So while it sounds like barbaric butchery, it was actually humanity's first foray into emergency neurosurgery. They were fixing a hardware problem with the only tools they had. Number 5. A spoonful of poop. Diarrhea has plagued humanity since the beginning of time. When you got a particularly nasty case of food poisoning in ancient China, your doctor might offer you something called yellow soup. The name sounds innocent enough. Maybe it's a nice squash bisque? The main ingredient in yellow soup was the fresh filtered stool of a healthy donor. You were, to put it bluntly, prescribed a poop smoothie. And you know what? It worked. This wasn't just some sick prank. It was a 4th century treatment for severe food poisoning and diarrhea that is, in principle, identical to a cutting-edge modern procedure called a fecal microbiota transplant, or FMT. Your gut is home to trillions of bacteria, a complex ecosystem known as your microbiome. When you get a nasty infection like C. diff, the bad bacteria take over, wipe out the good guys, and turn your digestive system into a war zone. The yellow soup worked by reintroducing a healthy, balanced army of good bacteria into your ravaged gut. These new troops would then multiply, outcompete the invaders, and restore order. It's like your gut is a lawn that's been overrun by weeds. The yellow soup was the ancient equivalent of scattering fresh grass seed all over the place to choke them out. The physicians of the time had no concept of bacteria or microbiomes, of course. They just knew that for some reason, feeding sick people the processed remains of a healthy person's dinner made them better. Today, we do it with screened, sanitized samples, often delivered in capsule form. A crapsule, if you will. But the principle is the same. They figured out one of the most complex interactions in the human body thousands of years ago, using a method that would make most of us gag. Number 4. Bloodsucking worms. You go to the doctor in the 1800s with a black eye. It's swollen, bruised, and throbbing. The doctor doesn't give you an ice pack. Instead, he opens a jar and pulls out a slimy, wriggling leech, which he then plops right onto your face. You have to sit there while this little vampire has its lunch, slowly draining the blood from your swollen flesh. It's the stuff of Gothic horror novels, but it was standard medical practice for thousands of years, and for certain conditions, it was shockingly effective. The ancient practice of bloodletting was mostly nonsense, based on a flawed theory of balancing the body's humors. But with leeches, they accidentally got something right. When a leech bites, it injects a cocktail of bioactive chemicals into your bloodstream. The most important of these is hirudin, a powerful anticoagulant that prevents blood from clotting. It also injects a vasodilator, which widens your blood vessels, and an anesthetic, so you barely feel the bite. This combination is perfect for relieving blood congestion. In the case of that black eye, the leech would drain the pooled, stagnant blood that was causing the swelling and pressure, while its saliva kept fresh blood flowing to the area to promote healing. It's so effective that leeches are still used in modern medicine, particularly in microsurgery. When a surgeon reattaches a severed finger, for example, it's often hard to reconnect the tiny veins. Blood flows in through the arteries but can't get out, causing the finger to become engorged and die. A medicinal leech applied to the fingertip acts as a temporary living drainage system, keeping the blood flowing until the veins can heal and re-establish circulation on their own. They are nature's perfect little blood-sucking pharmacists. Number 3. Poisoning yourself sane. In the ancient world, mental illness was often seen as a spiritual or moral failing. The treatments were, accordingly, pretty grim. One of the more popular cures for madness was a plant called hellebore. It's a lovely-looking flower, but it is violently toxic. The treatment involved giving a patient a dose of hellebore, which would induce an absolutely biblical episode of vomiting and diarrhea. The patient would be purged from both ends, violently and for hours. The theory was that you were physically expelling the black bile, or the evil humors that were causing the insanity. It was a full system flush, a biological exorcism. From a modern perspective, this sounds like pure torture. You're taking someone who is already suffering immensely and subjecting them to a traumatic physical ordeal. But here's the twisted part. Sometimes it appeared to work. Patients would occasionally become lucid and calm after the treatment. Why? There are a couple of theories. First, the sheer physical exhaustion and dehydration following such an episode would leave anyone in a subdued, almost catatonic state. It's hard to be manic when you don't have the energy to lift your own head. But there's also a biochemical possibility. Hellebore contains compounds that are cardiac glycosides and have complex effects on the nervous system. It's possible that these toxins acted as a crude, powerful sedative, essentially short-circuiting the overactive neural pathways in the brain. It was like trying to fix a buggy computer by yanking the power cord out of the wall and plugging it back in. A dangerous, unpredictable, and horrifying reboot for the human brain. It didn't cure them, but it tranquilized them through sheer systemic shock. Number 2. Fighting fire with fire. By the early 20th century, syphilis was a death sentence. It was a slow, agonizing disease that would eventually rot your brain, leading to paralysis, dementia, and death. There was no cure. Then along came an Austrian doctor named Julius Wagner Jahreg, who noticed something strange. Syphilis patients who contracted a different high-fever disease sometimes went into remission. He developed a theory that was both brilliant and completely insane. What if you could cure one deadly disease by intentionally giving the patient another one? His disease of choice? Malaria. Yes, the mosquito-borne illness famous for its recurring cycles of bone-rattling chills and sky-high fevers. His plan was to take late-stage syphilis patients, people with literally nothing left to lose, and inject them with malaria-infected blood. The goal was to induce a series of intense fevers, hoping the heat would kill the syphilis bacteria. It was a biological cage match. He was pitting one microscopic killer against another, inside the patient's body. And it worked. The syphilis bacterium, Treponema pallidum, is extremely sensitive to heat. The prolonged, scorching fevers of malaria, often reaching 104 degrees Fahrenheit, 40 degrees Celsius, or higher, were enough to cook the bacteria to death. After a dozen or so fever cycles, the patient would then be treated for the malaria with quinine, which was a well-known and effective cure. It was an incredibly risky procedure. About 15% of patients died from the malaria itself. But for the rest, it was a miracle. It was the first effective treatment for late-stage syphilis, and it won Wagner Jahreg the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1927. It's a terrifying reminder that sometimes the only way to kill a monster is to unleash an even bigger but more controllable monster to fight it. Number 1. The ice pick brain scramble. There is no medical procedure more infamous, more horrifying, or more symbolic of psychiatric overreach than the lobotomy. The very word conjures images of glassy-eyed, shuffling zombies. And yet, for a time, it was hailed as a miracle cure. It was a shockingly brutal procedure, especially the ice pick lobotomy pioneered by Dr. Walter Freeman. He would insert a long, sharp instrument, literally an ice pick from his kitchen in the early days, through the corner of the patient's eye socket, hammer it through the thin bone with a mallet, and then swish it back and forth to sever the connections in the frontal lobes of the brain. He did it in his office. It took 10 minutes. This sounds like something out of a Saw movie, not a medical textbook. So how could this possibly be considered a cure that worked? You have to understand the context. In the 1940s and 50s, psychiatric wards were overflowing with patients suffering from severe depression, schizophrenia, and anxiety. There were no effective drugs. These people were often violent, catatonic, or suicidal, and doomed to spend their entire lives locked in an asylum. The lobotomy was seen as a last resort, and for some, it worked in the most tragic sense of the word. By scrambling the connections in the part of the brain responsible for complex emotion, personality, and executive function, the procedure did often calm agitated patients. It reduced their anxiety and emotional outbursts. The problem is, it did so by turning them into passive, listless, emotionally blunted shells of their former selves. It didn't cure their illness. It destroyed their personality. It solved the problem of a difficult patient by essentially erasing the patient. It worked for the doctors and the overwhelmed asylum staff, but the cost was the patient's very soul. It stands as the ultimate, most horrifying example of a historical cure that technically achieved its goal, but in a way that should make us all profoundly grateful for modern medicine. That's all for today. I'll be making similar videos in the future. Subscribe to see them.